Maya Collins had faced some of the most dangerous missions, but she never expected the real threat to come from a police officer. A baseless traffic stop, a lie under oath, a system that had always tilted in one direction, ready to crush her. They wanted her to stay silent. But when the moment came, Maya did what she did best, expose the truth. And this time, all eyes were on her. Would justice prevail, or would another innocent life be buried beneath the weight of false accusations? Maya Collins tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of road ahead. The black Chevrolet glided smoothly along the near-empty highway. On either side, towering streetlights cast a pale, golden glow, their light bleeding into the night sky with an eerie stillness. She was no stranger to late-night drives like this, solitary, silent, and heavy with thought. The life of a CIA agent did not allow for long nights of sleep or warm family dinners. But she never complained. This was the path God had chosen for her. Maya glanced at the rearview mirror. A police car had been trailing her for some time. No flashing lights, no sirens, just its quiet, unshakable presence. She wasn't speeding. There was no reason to be pulled over. She took a slow breath, pushing down the weight creeping into her chest. Let my heart be steadfast. The Lord is always with me. The silent prayer echoed in her mind. Then, the red and blue lights flashed behind her. Maya's foot tensed on the gas pedal out of instinct, but she forced herself to ease off. She couldn't afford to act on reflex. From this moment on, every decision would determine how this night ended. She turned on her signal and pulled over. Every movement was precise, controlled, nothing to raise suspicion. The car behind her stopped. In the mirror, Maya saw a figure step out, moving toward her. The streetlight caught the gleam of a badge against a dark blue uniform. A white officer, tall and broad-shouldered, walking with slow, deliberate intent. Maya rolled down the window before he could ask. The man stopped by her door, his gaze sweeping over her like a predator sizing up its prey. His right hand rested on his holster. "You were speeding." His voice was cold, detached. Maya remained calm. "I don't believe so, officer. I've stayed within the limit. I said you were over. License and registration. No arguments. No provocation." Maya reached for her bag, moving deliberately, carefully. Years of training had taught her that the wrong motion could be all the justification someone needed to pull the trigger. The officer, Calloway, according to his nameplate, took her documents but didn't look at them right away. He kept his eyes on her. "Where are you coming from?" An unnecessary question, but Maya's voice remained steady. "A work meeting? At this hour?" Calloway frowned. Maya only smiled. Finally, he glanced at her papers. For a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. Maya caught it. He had seen her name, and now he was likely wondering what a black woman like her was doing in a car like this at this hour on this road. A few seconds of silence stretched between them. Then, Calloway slid her documents into his pocket instead of handing them back. "Step out of the car." Maya arched a brow. "God tests me, but he also grants me the wisdom to know when to yield." "Is there a problem, officer?" I said, "Step out of the car." His tone no longer carried the pretense of a request. It was an order. A faint breeze stirred the trees along the roadside. The highway remained empty, no witnesses. Maya knew she had no choice, but she also knew this was only the beginning. The highway was desolate. Streetlights cast dim, uneven patches of light on the asphalt, stretching into the distance like ghostly remnants of civilization. Maya Collins' Chevrolet sat neatly by the roadside, the police cruiser parked just behind it, its red and blue lights still flashing in the dark. Maya stepped out of the car as ordered. Her heels struck the pavement with a sharp, hollow sound, breaking the silence. Ryan Calloway stood before her, tall, imposing, his eyes carrying the weight of unchecked authority. His right hand rested lightly on his holster, not out of necessity, but as a silent threat. Hands on the hood, Maya studied him for a moment. "Officer, I have yet to receive a reasonable explanation for this." "You don't need an explanation. You just need to comply." Maya tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. I thought our legal system worked the other way around, officer. Calloway's brow twitched, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. You know, Collins, I've met a lot of people like you. Like me? The kind who think they're smarter than the police. Who think they get to ask the questions instead of answering them. Maybe that's because we know our rights. Calloway scoffed. Let me remind you of something. On this road, at this hour, the only right you have is the right to remain silent. He stepped closer. And unless you want me to toss you in the back seat right now, I suggest you put your hands on the hood. Maya drew a slow breath. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she knew that men like Calloway saw a black woman standing her ground as a threat, and that made him dangerous. She placed her palms on the hood. The metal was ice cold beneath her skin. Calloway moved behind her. He began the search. His hands skimmed over her waist, supposedly checking for weapons. But he wasn't following protocol. His movements were too slow, too rough. What exactly are you looking for, officer? Maya's voice was edged with steel. Weapons. Contraband. Anything that gives me a reason to put you in a cell tonight. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Lord, grant me patience. Something wrong? Calloway leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. You seem tense. Maya clenched her jaw. She had dealt with men far more dangerous than him. The difference was Calloway had a badge, and the law was on his side. She couldn't afford a misstep. He continued his search, his hands sliding lower down her legs. Then, without warning, he leaned in even closer. Tell me, Collins, he murmured. What kind of work do you do to afford a car like this? I work hard, just like you should be doing right now. Calloway smirked, his eyes darkening. You work hard, huh? He let out a quiet, humorless laugh. You know what I think? I think you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe with the wrong people. Maya narrowed her eyes. The wrong people? That's right. Calloway's gaze hardened. Because people who look like you don't usually live like this. Don't usually drive cars like this. Don't usually have enough authority to question a cop. The air between them grew thick. Maya turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. And people like you don't usually meet someone like me, do they? Calloway's jaw tightened. Then, without warning, he grabbed her wrist and spun her around. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Maya didn't move. I'm complying, but I still haven't been given a charge. Obstruction of a police officer, Calloway said immediately, as if he had rehearsed it. Obstruction? Maya arched a brow. How? By asking too many damn questions. The cold snap of metal filled the air as the handcuffs clamped around her wrists. You think you can control the narrative, don't you? Maya asked, her voice steady, unwavering. No, I don't think. Calloway leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know. Maya took a deep breath. He thought he had one. He didn't realize he had just stepped into a battle far bigger than himself. Be careful, Officer Calloway, she murmured. You may control one person, but you can't control the truth. Calloway didn't respond. He just shoved her toward the patrol car. She was forced into the backseat. The door slammed shut. Darkness closed in, but Maya wasn't afraid, because she knew God stood on the side of justice, and she would see Calloway again, in court. Morning at the holding facility. The dull light of dawn seeped through the iron bars, carrying the lingering dampness of last night's rain. Maya Collins sat on the narrow metal cot, her eyes wide open, alert despite not having slept. She hadn't closed her eyes. She couldn't. She knew today mattered. Today, she would stand before the ones who thought they could bury the truth beneath their power. The heavy clang of a metal door echoed through the silence. Collins, on your feet. A corrections officer stepped inside, barely sparing her a glance. He barked the order like she was nothing more than an object to be moved from one place to another. Maya inhaled deeply and stood. They could imprison her body, but they could never shackle her spirit. The jail corridor. As she walked, officers passed by, some watching her with quiet curiosity, others making no effort to hide their disdain. Another one who thinks they're a victim of the system, a voice muttered behind her. We already know what she'll say in court, another chimed in. I did nothing wrong. I was discriminated against. I'm just a victim. Soft laughter followed. Maya didn't react. She had heard it all before. People like them didn't care about the truth, only about protecting the power they held. She kept walking, her posture straight. Those with faith never bowed to lies. The courthouse hallway. Outside the courtroom, the press had already gathered. Reporters clutched cameras and microphones, poised like vultures waiting for a moment worth capturing. Ryan Calloway was there, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He smirked as he saw her. "Sleep well, Collins?" Maya met his gaze, saying nothing. "You seem confident," Calloway continued. "I think you'd understand the situation by now. You're about to walk into a courtroom where no one will believe you over me." Maya tilted her head, a slow smile curling at her lips. "You know what's funny, Calloway?" she whispered. "The truth doesn't need permission to exist." For a split second, his smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "That's a nice sentiment," he said. "But there's something you seem to forget." He stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "You're the one on trial. I'm the cop. I'm the one they trust." Maya didn't blink. "I'll see you inside, Calloway." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, but in there, I'll be on the witness stand." He smirked. "And you? You'll be in the defendant's seat." Inside the courtroom, James Whitaker was already waiting near the door. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, his face weathered by years in the legal trenches. His eyes, however, remained sharp and resolute. "You holding up?" he asked the moment she approached. "Better than most people think," Maya replied. Whitaker nodded, though concern still lingered in his expression. "I need you to be ready. Nathan Pierce is a shark. He knows how to twist a simple story into a damning indictment." Maya gave a steady nod. "You don't need to fight," Whitaker continued. "You just need to stay calm. Remember this. Justice in a courtroom isn't the same as justice in the world. Here, the one who tells the better story wins." Maya held his gaze. "Then let's tell ours well." Whitaker chuckled under his breath. "I like the way you think. But don't forget, the jury doesn't just hear the truth. They hear what they want to believe." The courtroom doors swung open. Maya stepped inside. Ryan Calloway was already there. At the far end of the room, Nathan Pierce stood waiting. The trial was about to begin. The real battle had arrived. Inside the courtroom, the harsh glow of overhead lights reflected off polished wood surfaces. The room was packed. Reporters, witnesses, and unfamiliar faces from the public, all eager to witness the unfolding trial. Maya Collins sat at the defense table. She wore a dark suit, one that Whitaker had prepared for her. Though faint red marks from last night's handcuffs still lingered on her wrists, her posture remained steady, her expression calm. Across the room, Ryan Calloway sat beside prosecutor Nathan Pierce. Arms crossed, his face was cold, confident. On the judge's bench, Richard Monroe flipped through a file, his stern gaze betraying an unmistakable bias. A man with over 20 years on the bench, he had always leaned in favor of law enforcement, especially when the defendant wasn't white. He looked up at Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, you may proceed." Pierce rose to his feet. A tall, wiry man with neatly combed blonde hair. He carried himself with a controlled precision. His eyes were sharp, his presence deliberate. He strode to the center of the room, turning toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, assured. "We are here today to examine a simple case." He paused, sweeping his gaze over the jurors, planting the first seeds of persuasion. A police officer doing his job. He gestured toward Calloway, as though presenting a hero, and an individual who refused to respect the law. A few jurors nodded slightly. Pierce had not presented evidence, only an image, a dangerous black woman challenging authority. The defendant, Maya Collins, failed to comply when asked to pull over. She argued with the officer, questioned his authority instead of following instructions. When ordered out of the vehicle, she continued to resist, forcing Officer Calloway to take necessary action to ensure safety. He walked slowly, deliberately, voice lowering as if sharing a solemn truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a nation of laws. No one is above the law, not even Maya Collins." A heavy silence settled over the room. "And today, I believe you won't need long to reach a verdict." He stepped back to his seat. A few jurors exchanged glances, some already casting wary looks at Maya. They had been swayed from the very first moment. The defense table. Whitaker tapped Maya's hand lightly, a silent reassurance. "Don't worry," he murmured. "That was theater, nothing more. We'll turn this around." Maya gave a small nod. The first witness, Ryan Calloway. Pierce stood. "I call my witness, Officer Ryan Calloway." Calloway rose, straightening his uniform before stepping onto the stand. He placed a hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Maya watched him. She knew he was about to lie. "Officer Calloway," Pierce began, "please tell us what happened that night." Calloway cleared his throat, his voice steady, confident. "Around 11:30 p.m., I was patrolling the highway when I spotted a Chevrolet traveling at high speed. I activated my lights and initiated a traffic stop." Pierce nodded, feigning neutrality. "And at that point, how did the driver, the defendant, Maya Collins, respond?" "She was uncooperative from the start. Instead of complying immediately, she began questioning me, challenging why I had stopped her." He paused, glancing toward the jury, gauging their reactions before continuing. "I instructed her to step out of the vehicle for safety reasons. She continued to resist, making the situation more tense." Pierce paced, his movements purposeful, allowing Calloway's words to settle. "And in that moment, Officer Calloway, how did you feel?" "Honestly," Calloway exhaled, shaking his head slightly, "I was concerned. A driver refusing to cooperate can be a potential threat. I had to act quickly to ensure my own safety and that of others." Pierce turned to the jury. "What we have here is an officer simply doing his job." Then, shifting his gaze toward Maya, he added, "And an individual who refused to obey the law, escalating a situation that should have been simple." He let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "So I ask you, who is more credible? A police officer fulfilling his duty, or a lawbreaker?" Maya curled her fingers into a fist beneath the table. Calloway didn't flinch. He thought he had control of this story. Maya remained silent, but she knew his performance wouldn't last forever. Truth could not stay buried, and she would be the one to unearth it. The courtroom was thick with tension. Prosecutor Nathan Pierce took his seat, having finished his questioning. On the witness stand, Ryan Calloway sat upright, the confidence still etched across his face. He believed he had full control of the story. But Maya knew the real story hadn't even begun. James Whitaker rose, adjusting the button on his suit jacket. "I'd like to cross-examine the witness." Judge Monroe gave a curt nod. Whitaker strode forward, slow and deliberate, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Officer Calloway, you stated that the defendant was uncooperative when you pulled her over. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Calloway replied, his voice firm. "Could you be more specific?" Calloway arched a brow. "She questioned me instead of following orders. She displayed clear resistance." "And what exactly did she ask?" A brief hesitation. Calloway recovered quickly. "Unnecessary questions, like why I pulled her over, whether she had broken any laws. People who resist always try to make things difficult for the police." Maya tilted her head. "People who resist?" Whitaker's smile was thin, but his eyes were sharp. "So, in your view, when someone asks about their rights, that automatically makes them resistant?" "Not necessarily. But when someone keeps arguing with an officer, it escalates the situation." Whitaker gave a slow nod. "Escalates." The defendant had no weapon, no criminal record, and made no threats. What exactly made her dangerous? A flicker of unease passed through Calloway's face. Her attitude. Whitaker let the words hang in the air, then turned slightly toward the jury. "So what you're saying is someone can be considered dangerous purely because of their attitude?" Calloway clenched his jaw. "No, I meant." He stopped, realizing he was being led into a corner. "A driver needs to follow police instructions, not debate them." Whitaker tilted his head. "And if a white driver had asked those same questions, would you have considered them dangerous?" Silence rippled through the courtroom. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "I don't discriminate. I do my job." "Of course," Whitaker said smoothly. "Let's move on. Next subject, the arrest." "Officer Calloway, You stated that the defendant was arrested for obstructing an officer. Is that correct? Yes. And what specifically did she do to obstruct you? She didn't exit the vehicle immediately when ordered. But eventually, she did? Yes, but... So she complied with your command? Calloway's jaw tensed. She did, but not immediately. Whitaker nodded slowly. So let me summarize. She pulled over when instructed. She provided her paperwork when asked. She stepped out of the car when ordered. And yet, she was still handcuffed for obstruction? A shift went through the jury. A few exchanged glances. Calloway's breathing grew shallow. I did it for safety reasons, he said quickly. Safety for whom? Whitaker pressed. Calloway hesitated. From the prosecutor's table, Nathan Pierce shot to his feet. Objection. Counsel is leading the witness. Judge Monroe banged his gavel, displeased. Sustained. Mr. Whitaker, stay on track. Whitaker's smile barely flickered. Of course, Your Honor. I'm merely establishing a key point. That there was no lawful reason for Maya Collins to be arrested that night. Maya curled her fingers into a fist beneath the table. She knew the battle wasn't over. But she also knew the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks. He thought he could control the story. What he didn't realize was the real story was just beginning. The sharp crack of what echoed through the courtroom as Judge Monroe brought his gavel down. Mr. Whitaker, you may call your next witness. James Whitaker rose, the dark fabric of his suit settling neatly around his lean frame. He stepped into the center of the room, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Your Honor, I call the defendant, Maya Collins, to the stand. A murmur rippled through the jury box. This was what they had been waiting for, to hear from the woman herself, to see who she was, why she was here, and whether she had truly defied the police, as Prosecutor Pierce had so carefully painted her to be. Maya took a slow, steady breath before standing. Her steps were firm, unwavering. The dark suit she wore only accentuated her composed presence. There was no trace of fear, no sign of unease. She had faced dangers far greater than this. As she ascended the witness stand, her eyes swept across the room. The jury, 12 faces filled with curiosity and scrutiny. Pierce, calm on the surface, but his fingers curled just a little too tightly against the table. And Calloway, sitting stiff, his jaw visibly clenched. She placed one hand on the Bible, raising the other. Ms. Collins, Judge Monroe's voice carried an unmistakable weight, his gaze probing. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Maya met his eyes without hesitation. I swear, before this court, and before God. In that moment, no one could doubt her sincerity. Whitaker approached her with deliberate ease, knowing that every step, every pause, dictated the rhythm of the trial. Ms. Collins, for the benefit of the court, could you please state your occupations? Maya's expression remained unreadable. She knew the weight of the truth she was about to release. Her gaze locked onto the jury. Then, in a voice steady and unwavering, she said, I am a CIA agent. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. For several seconds, not a single breath was drawn too loudly. The only person to react instantly was Calloway. His eyes twitched slightly, his grip on the table tightening so hard his knuckles turned white. Prosecutor Pierce remained still, but his hands were now tightly clasped together in front of him. He hadn't known this. Judge Monroe's face hardened, his fingers tightening around his gavel. He cleared his throat, an attempt to regain control. Ms. Collins, he said, voice edged with skepticism. Could you repeat that? Maya's gaze didn't waver. I am a CIA agent. I work within a specialized unit that handles classified operations requiring high-level security clearance. The jury stirred. A few members leaned forward, their interest piqued in a way it hadn't been before. Maya continued, her voice strong but devoid of theatrics. I don't say this to ask for special treatment. I say it because I want you to understand exactly who I am. I was not just some random woman driving down a highway that night. I was not a troublemaker or a criminal resisting arrest. She let her words settle, then added, I know the law better than most, and I know I did nothing wrong. Silence stretched long and heavy. Calloway blinked rapidly, his head dipping slightly. The arrogant confidence he had worn earlier was no longer present. Pierce, though outwardly composed, was clearly recalculating his strategy. Judge Monroe leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He couldn't outright dismiss what Maya had just revealed, but he also couldn't let it tip the balance of the trial too quickly. "Proceed," he said, his voice rough. Maya let her gaze sweep across the room. She had just dropped a bombshell on the trial, but she knew revealing the truth wasn't enough to win. Now, she had to prove why it mattered. The real battle was only beginning. The courtroom remained suspended in silence. Maya Collins' identity had been revealed. But just as the weight of that truth began to shift the atmosphere, Prosecutor Nathan Pierce moved swiftly to regain control. He rose abruptly, striding to the center of the room with practiced confidence. His voice was steady, measured, guiding the jury's thoughts before they could stray too far. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his sharp gaze sweeping across the jury box, "I must emphasize one simple fact. Whether or not the defendant is a CIA agent does not change the reality that she failed to comply with law enforcement that night." A brief pause, just long enough for his words to settle into their minds. In fact, given her professional training, one might argue that she, more than anyone, should have understood the importance of following a police officer's orders. A calculated counterstrike. He didn't discredit Maya's background. He turned it into a liability. At the witness stand, Maya remained still. She knew Pierce was a master at manipulating perception, at shaping narratives to suit his case. James Whitaker rose calmly from his seat. He smoothed the front of his jacket as he approached Maya, his voice measured but unwavering. "Miss Collins, the prosecutor suggests that because of your legal training, you should have complied faster. Do you have a response to that?" Maya tilted her head slightly, eyes locking onto Pierce. "I did comply. I provided my paperwork. I followed orders. But what I did not do was remain silent when my rights were being violated." Her voice was even, steady, not raised, not angry, but every word was razor sharp. Then she turned, facing the jury, slowly, intentionally. "When power is used to oppress, we are not meant to stay silent. Because if we do, who will speak for justice?" The air in the room shifted. The jury was listening. An older woman with silver hair, seated in the middle row, gave the smallest nod. A white man, arms crossed over his chest, no longer looked so certain of his stance. They were wavering. Pierce saw it too. He couldn't afford to let Maya take control of the room. Pierce fights to regain ground. The prosecutor turned sharply to Judge Monroe, seeking an intervention. "Your Honor, I request that the jury remain unaffected by the defendant's profession. This trial must focus on the facts, not on her job title." Monroe's gaze flickered between Pierce and Maya. He remained silent for a moment before finally bringing his gavel down. "The jury will consider all aspects of this case in their entirety. We will proceed." His ruling was neutral, but it didn't matter. Maya had already planted the seed of doubt. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at Ryan Calloway. He was still sitting there, but the arrogance was gone. No more crossed legs, no more relaxed posture. His hands were now clasped tightly over his knees, fingers interlocked. He was tense. He was beginning to realize that this fight was no longer his to control. Maya stepped down from the witness stand. She didn't know if her testimony alone would be enough to turn the tide completely. But she knew one thing. They were starting to listen. The truth was out. But was it strong enough to crush the lies? The air in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating. The jury remained outwardly neutral, but Maya knew. Doubt had begun to seep into their minds. Ryan Calloway sat motionless, his hands gripping his knees. The arrogance he had carried before was gone. Prosecutor Pierce, though maintaining a composed facade, tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a subtle tell of unease. James Whitaker stood, smoothing the front of his suit before stepping forward. "Your Honor, I would like to present a crucial piece of evidence. The body cam footage from Officer Calloway on the night of the incident." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. From the bench, Judge Monroe narrowed his eyes at Whitaker. Pierce shot up instantly. "Objection!" His voice was sharp, urgent. This footage has not been fully verified and may have been altered. Whitaker turned to him, a quiet smile touching his lips. Oh, surely the prosecutor isn't suggesting that a police officer's own body cam footage could have been tampered with. Pierce pressed his lips into a thin line, but refused to concede. A video clip does not tell the full story. A few minutes of footage cannot capture the entirety of what transpired that night. Whitaker gave a slow nod. I completely agree. That's why we'll be viewing the most crucial part. From the moment Ms. Collins was pulled over to the moment she was placed under arrest. Silence settled over the room. Judge Monroe exhaled, then brought his gavel down. Objection overruled. The footage will be shown. Calloway swallowed hard. The courtroom screen flickered to life, emitting a soft beep before the video began playing. No one spoke. The jury, Prosecutor Pierce, Judge Monroe, they were all focused on the screen. And most of all, Calloway. He was no longer leaning back, no longer at ease. He was holding his breath. The footage begins. The desolate highway appeared on screen. Maya's Chevrolet sat on the roadside, engine humming softly. Calloway's approach was illuminated by his flashlight as he tapped on her window. His voice rang out, clear and undeniable. You were speeding? Maya's response came, calm but firm. I don't believe I was, officer. Calloway knocked lightly on the roof of her car. You don't need to believe it. I decide that. A few jurors frowned. His tone did not match the professional image he had painted for himself in court. The crackle of his radio filled the silence. Maya reached into her bag, pulling out her documents. She did not argue. She did not resist. She complied. Yet Calloway barely glanced at the papers before folding them shut and slipping them into his pocket. Step out of the car. His voice was curt. Why? Maya's tone remained even measured. It was a simple question. I don't need to explain myself to you. The room fell into an eerie quiet. In the jury box, an older white man uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. His expression tightened as though he had just noticed something that hadn't quite sat right. On the screen, Maya opened her car door and stepped out. I'm cooperating, but I have the right to know why I'm being detained. Calloway's voice dropped lower, taking on a sharper edge. Are you giving me a hard time? No, I'm asking a lawful question. Calloway glanced down the empty highway. No witnesses. No one to intervene. Then his next words fell from his lips, words that would unravel everything. People like you don't usually live like this. Don't usually drive cars like this. Don't usually have the right to talk back to a cop. The courtroom froze. The jury sat paralyzed. Whitaker turned, his gaze resting on Calloway. Prosecutor Pierce had gone pale. And Calloway was rigid, his face drained of color. He hadn't thought this would come out. He had been so sure he could control the story. He had believed his testimony would be the only truth that mattered. But now, he was his own undoing. The jury exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Others looked genuinely stunned. An older white woman turned to whisper something to the juror beside her. A younger man, likely a law student, furrowed his brows deeply. Whitaker said nothing. He didn't need to. The video was doing all the talking. On screen, Maya remained composed. But now, no one could say she had been resistant. Whitaker stepped forward at last, his eyes landing on Calloway. The officer refused to meet his gaze. The truth was undeniable, but the fight was far from over. The liar had been exposed. But would justice prevail? The courtroom had stopped breathing. Calloway's words from the video still echoed in everyone's minds. People like you don't usually live like this. Don't usually drive cars like this. Don't usually have the right to talk back to a cop. The jury sat frozen. Some exchanged glances, the weight of doubt now evident on their faces. Ryan Calloway had gone pale. He sat rigid, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His fingers interlocked, knuckles turning white from the strain. At the prosecutor's table, Nathan Pierce struggled to maintain composure, but his fingers had stopped tapping against the desk, a small but telling sign. He knew. He had just lost a crucial piece of this battle. Maya didn't take her eyes off Calloway. He couldn't look back at her. James Whitaker remained silent for a moment, watching the jury, letting the weight of the evidence settle into their thoughts. Then, when the timing was right, he stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Officer Calloway, do you remember saying this?" Calloway swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the edge of his chair. I don't recall exactly. It was a long, stressful night." Whitaker gave a slow nod, as if he had expected this answer. "You don't recall?" He let the words hang in the air before turning to the court technician. "Play the footage again. Timestamp 2:34. The screen lit up once more. Calloway, standing in front of Maya's car, his face smug, his posture authoritative. And then, his own voice, loud and unmistakable. "People like you don't usually live like this." Whitaker switched off the screen. This time he didn't need to say a word. The entire courtroom had heard it for themselves. Calloway was trapped in his own lie. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the room. Even Judge Monroe, who had maintained his neutrality for most of the trial, now wore an expression of thinly veiled displeasure. The jury had shifted. A white woman in the front row folded her arms, shaking her head slightly. A middle-aged man, previously stiff and unreadable, now frowned deeply. Whitaker turned back to Calloway. "Do you remember now?" Calloway blinked rapidly, at a loss for words. I didn't mean it like that." "Didn't mean it?" Whitaker repeated. "Are you saying those words just slipped out, completely unprovoked?" "I was just doing my job." Calloway's voice cracked, his frustration spilling over. But the second the words left his mouth, he realized he had made a mistake. The jury began whispering amongst themselves. Pierce scrambles to salvage the case. Seeing Calloway unravel, Pierce shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." Defense counsel is focusing on a single comment rather than the entire context of the incident. Judge Monroe, who had been observing quietly, crossed his arms before speaking. "Mr. Pierce, that single comment is not just a passing remark. It speaks to the attitude and intent of the witness." Objection overruled. Pierce gritted his teeth. He turned to Calloway, his expression laced with frustration. He knew there was no salvaging this now. Whitaker delivers the final blow. The defense attorney faced the jury, taking slow, deliberate steps as he spoke. "You have just seen the truth with your own eyes. You have just heard it with your own ears." He let the weight of his words sink in before continuing. There was no resistance, no aggression, no threat from Maya Collins. Only a police officer who abused his authority. A beat of silence. Then, Whitaker locked eyes with each juror, one by one. "So tell me, who is more credible?" No one answered, because the answer was already clear. Pierce tried to steady himself, but the case was crumbling beneath him. Calloway lowered his head, his eyes hollow. Maya inhaled deeply. She had fought too long, too hard for this moment. But was it enough? Would the jury stand on the side of justice? The courtroom was thick with tension. The body cam footage had shattered Ryan Calloway's testimony. The jury, those who had once harbored doubts about Maya Collins, now had their answer. Nathan Pierce knew he was losing control. He needed one last move to turn the tide. Rising to his feet, he adjusted his tie, forcing a composed expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, measured. "Regardless of what this video may suggest, we cannot judge an entire situation based on a single moment." He turned to the jury, his gaze sweeping over them like a man grasping for their trust. "Put yourselves in Officer Calloway's position. It was late at night. He had to make split-second decisions. And if, in the heat of the moment, he misspoke, should we condemn his entire career for it?" A calculated pause, just long enough for doubt to creep back in. "We are here to decide a case of obstruction, not to put a police officer on trial over a poorly chosen phrase." A few jurors shifted in their seats, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. Pierce had struck at their instincts, their belief in law enforcement. But Whitaker had been ready for this. James Whitaker inhaled deeply before rising, his voice calm, unwavering. "The prosecutor says we cannot judge this case on a single moment." He turned, facing the jury. "But if you look back at everything we have seen and heard over the past 2 days, you will realize this was never just a single moment." He took a step forward, commanding the room without raising his voice. From the beginning, Maya Collins cooperated. She presented her documents. She did nothing wrong. And when no wrongdoing was found, Officer Calloway created one. Whitaker moved closer, not toward Calloway, but toward the jury, his gaze locked on them. Ask yourselves this. If a white driver had asked the same questions as Maya that night, would they have been in handcuffs? Silence. Awaited, undeniable silence. The jury did not speak, but they didn't have to. The answer was already there. Judge Richard Monroe exhaled, pressing his hands against the bench. There was no way around this. He had remained neutral throughout the trial, but at this moment, the truth was too glaring to ignore. His gaze shifted to the jury. Members of the jury, you will now have time to deliberate before reaching your final verdict. A court officer led the jury out of the room. Maya closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Beside her, Whitaker rested a hand against the table, nodding slightly. We've done everything we could. Now we wait. She curled her fingers into a fist, steadying herself with one certainty. Justice could be delayed, but it could not be denied. Across the courtroom, Ryan Calloway sat stiffly, the arrogance drained from his face. Nathan Pierce remained silent, his expression dark, his loss weighing heavy. Maya tilted her head back, gazing at the ceiling, where the courtroom lights glowed brightly overhead. And she thought, God always stands with the truth, but was the truth strong enough to bring justice? The air in the courtroom was thick as stone. All eyes were locked on the jury box, where 12 people were preparing to deliver the final verdict. Maya Collins clenched her hands slightly, the cold from the wooden bench seeping into her palms. Across the room, Prosecutor Nathan Pierce closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again, masking the unease buried beneath his sharp gaze. Ryan Calloway sat motionless. His legs were no longer crossed, his once smug expression completely erased. His wrists rested on his knees, fingers interlaced, gripping so tightly his knuckles had turned white. James Whitaker leaned slightly toward Maya, his voice low but steady. No matter the outcome, you did the most important thing. You forced them to see the truth. Maya nodded, but she also knew truth didn't always win. And this was the moment that would decide everything. Judge Richard Monroe's gavel struck the bench. Members of the jury, you will now retire to deliberate and render your final verdict. The 12 jurors rose and exited the courtroom. The door closed behind them, leaving Maya, Whitaker, Calloway, Pierce, and everyone else in an unbearable silence. Maya exhaled softly, waiting. It was the hardest part. Time crawled painfully slow. An hour passed. Outside the deliberation room, the red light above the door remained on, a sign that the jury had yet to reach a unanimous decision. Maya couldn't stop the thoughts from creeping in. Is someone still doubting? Does anyone still believe Calloway? She glanced across the courtroom. Pierce sat with his arms crossed, his gaze sharp, but his foot tapped lightly against the floor, a crack in his composure. Calloway hadn't lifted his head. He had lied under oath. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The only question left was, would the jury dare to rule against a police officer? Then, a sharp sound cut through the tension. The deliberation room door swung open. Maya snapped her head toward it. The jury had returned. The foreman, a middle-aged man, held a neatly folded slip of paper in his hands. His face was calm, unreadable. Maya held her breath. Everyone rose. Judge Monroe turned to the jury foreman, his voice carrying through the heavy silence. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman gave a single nod. Yes, Your Honor, we have. Maya's hands curled into fists. Calloway swallowed hard. Whitaker took a slow, deep breath. Pierce's brow furrowed, his fingers grazing the edge of the table. The jury had decided. The courtroom was so silent that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. The jury had returned, settling into their seats. Their faces remained neutral, betraying nothing of the decision they had reached. 12 people, 12 unreadable expressions. The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood, holding a small slip of paper. He glanced at Maya briefly, but his eyes revealed nothing. Judge Monroe struck his gavel against the bench, his voice steady and commanding. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman gave a single nod. Yes, Your Honor, we have. Maya held her breath. Beside her, James Whitaker remained still, his presence steady and grounding. He said nothing, but his quiet confidence anchored her. She turned her head slightly, glancing across the room. Ryan Calloway sat frozen. From the moment the jury entered, he had lost all semblance of composure. His jaw was clenched, his hands woven together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He didn't know what was coming. He no longer controlled the story. He only knew that the jury had seen the video. They had heard his own voice, his own words of prejudice, of abuse. And now, there was nothing he could do to stop the consequences. Beside him, Nathan Pierce maintained a professional posture, but Maya didn't miss the tension in his movements. He exhaled once, slow and deliberate, before opening his eyes, sharp and calculating, like a predator trapped with no way out. He was already thinking of an escape plan, not for Calloway, for himself, because in the end, Pierce's only loyalty was to his own career. But could he still salvage it? The foreman cleared his throat, then read aloud, his voice crisp, unwavering. On the charge of obstructing a police officer, we find the defendant, Maya Collins. Not guilty. Maya closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. In that moment, the weight of every doubt, every fear, every injustice she had carried over the past few days, shattered. She had won, not through power, not through sympathy. She had won with the truth. When she opened her eyes, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow across the courtroom. She had fought too long to see this moment. Whitaker gave her a small nod, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. No words were needed. They both understood. They had done it. A few members of the audience clapped softly. Others whispered to one another. In the jury box, some members nodded toward Maya, not with hesitation, but with respect. An older white woman, the one Maya had noticed early on, gave her a gentle smile. A middle-aged man, arms crossed over his chest, exhaled as if releasing a weight he hadn't realized he was holding. They had seen the truth, and they had chosen to stand with it. Across the room, Ryan Calloway had gone completely pale. He didn't react at first. He just sat there, eyes empty, hands unmoving. He blinked once, then twice, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. No, this can't be happening. But it was. He had lost. And he knew. This was only the beginning of his downfall. Nathan Pierce clenched his jaw. He had lost this case, but he knew he couldn't afford to let it ruin him. Slowly, he stood, stepping toward Calloway. He leaned down, his voice low, edged with quiet finality. Take care of yourself, Calloway. Then he walked away. Judge Monroe's expression remained reluctant. He had never been on Maya's side, but even he couldn't deny the evidence before him. He struck the gavel down one last time, sealing the decision. Maya Collins, this court finds you not guilty. You are free to go immediately. The moment those words left his lips, Maya closed her eyes for a single beat. Free. The word echoed through her mind, stronger than anything else. They had tried to take it from her, but she had reclaimed it. And more than that, she had proven that truth had the power to shift the course of justice. She turned, scanning the room one last time. This victory was not just for her. She had not fought only for herself. She had fought for those who could not speak. But the real fight was far from over. The courtroom had yet to settle. Though the verdict had been delivered, the weight of the trial still lingered in the air, etched onto every face, reflected in every glance. Maya Collins had been vindicated, but justice did not end with a verdict. Outside the windows, the sun had begun its descent, streaking the sky with hues of amber and gold. Inside, a new chapter was unfolding. Ryan Calloway remained seated, unmoving. He hadn't reacted when Maya was declared not guilty. No outburst, no protest, just emptiness in his eyes. But he knew exactly what was coming. He could feel the weight of the stares around him, some filled with contempt, others with disappointment, and some merely cold and detached. His time was up. Judge Monroe turned to prosecutor Nathan Pierce, his expression unreadable but laced with quiet disapproval. "Officer Calloway, stand up." Calloway flinched. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his fingers unconsciously gripping the edge of the table. "In light of the evidence presented in this court," Monroe continued, his voice firm, "I am ordering a formal investigation into your abuse of power and perjury under oath." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Calloway hadn't just lost the case. He was about to lose everything. At the back of the room, the doors opened. Two internal affairs officers stepped inside. And this time, he was the one being led away. Maya watched the moment unfold. She didn't feel triumphant, only a quiet sense of inevitability. If Calloway had chosen a different path, things might not have ended this way. But he had chosen deception, and that deception had destroyed him. Nathan Pierce stood motionless as Calloway was escorted out. He didn't sigh. He didn't react. But Maya knew he was calculating. Pierce was a survivor. He had seen too many trials, too many scandals. He knew when to cut his losses to protect his own image. And right now, he was preparing to walk away. He picked up his briefcase, adjusted his collar, and left without a single word to Calloway. The pawn had served its purpose, and Pierce wouldn't allow himself to be dragged down with him. Maya watched as he disappeared through the doors. She knew he wouldn't give up his power so easily. But at least, today he had lost. She took a deep breath as the doors swung open before her. The air outside was crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the courtroom. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the pavement, long golden streaks glinting off the asphalt. She was free, but what moved her most wasn't her own freedom. It was the fact that the truth had been heard. Justice had won. Outside the courthouse, a crowd was waiting. Reporters, supporters, strangers who had followed her case from the beginning. Some held up signs. Justice for all. No one stands above the truth. An older black woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "You did it, Maya." Maya offered a small smile. "Not just me. Everyone helped." The woman shook her head, taking Maya's hands in hers. Her voice was low, steady. "No, child. No one could have spoken for you better than you did for yourself. God stood beside you today." A quiet peace settled in Maya's chest. She had never been the type to lean on faith, but in this moment she believed she had not walked alone. Maya lifted her gaze to the sky. She knew the fight for justice didn't end in a single courtroom. There were thousands of Maya Collinses out there. People without voices, people buried beneath lies, people without the power to defend themselves. And she couldn't turn away from them. James Whitaker stepped beside her, his voice calm. "What will you do next?" Maya took a deep breath. Then she smiled. "Keep fighting?" Whitaker nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected. As she stepped away from the courthouse that day, Maya Collins was not just a woman who had been acquitted. She had become a symbol of truth, and her story was only just beginning. Maya has won, but how many others are still buried beneath lies and abuse of power? Does justice truly exist, or does it only appear when we force it to? What do you think about this case? Leave a comment below. Share this story so more people can know the truth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the most shocking trials.